What up, everybody? So, in today's video, I thought that I would talk about something called the Mandela effect. Now, some of you probably have heard of the Mandela effect, others of you probably have never even heard of such a thing. I didn't know about it until quite a while ago. Somebody asked me about it, and I'm like, no, I've never heard of that before. Basically, what it is in a nutshell is where a bunch of people remember something in the past but now is different. So it isn't actually what they thought it was. And so a lot of people come up with a lot of different explanations. Some of them are really wild, like we're switching in and out of parallel universes and things like that, while others are much more simpler explanations, such as it's just false memories. Our memory isn't as good as we think. And of course, there's always going to be, those conspiracy people that just love to hop on this and, come up with all these wild ideas. So, anyways, one of the ones that really caught my attention was Curious George. I seem to recollect that Curious George had a tail. Although, to be honest, the more that I thought about it, I started to realize I'm not so sure what I actually remember. And with a lot of the Mandela effects examples, I noticed myself trying to think back when I was a kid. But yet, even though I think that's what it was, if I'm humble enough, I'll be honest and say, no, I'm not quite sure actually if that was the case or not. And I think that is what actually a lot of people do with this Mandela effect is instead of reevaluating their own memory and actually considering the possibility that maybe they didn't get it right, maybe their memory isn't as good as they thought, instead have this ego, they have this pride thing where, no, I can't be wrong. I know that it's this way. I know, and I just know that it looked like this or was said this way. And so they just can't be humble enough to consider the possibility that, hey, maybe their memory wasn't so good. So they have to then get an explanation. And so then they look for whatever explanation they can find, some of the more conspiratory, compelling ones, like the parallel universe. But, a lot of times with these Mandela effect examples, it can be just a simple thing like wording. So like is instead of the, a instead of the, and, or in. And if you say those things, like the sentence or the line or the title of the movie really quick, a lot of times your brain can just perceive and pick up what it thought it said, but when in reality it said something else, and it was just a different word, one word. Another example is the Fruit Loops example. A lot of people remember it being F-R-U-I-T instead of F-R-O-O-T. And when I first saw that, I too thought it was fruit, because, you'd think fruit is, why would they spell it with two O's? But then the more that I thought about it as a child, I realized, well, that kind of makes sense, because for one, the loops has two O's and fruit has two O's, so it kind of matches, it goes together. And so that would imprint into your memory as a kid. You would just remember something like that. And the other thing is that apparently when Fruit Loops first came out, I looked on the internet and it says that when Fruit Loops first came out, they actually did spell it with F-R-U-I-T. But then there was a lawsuit. So when Fruit Loops came, they lost the lawsuit because the person claimed that there was no fruit actually in the cereal. So they had to change the name to F-R-O-O-T. And so ever since then, And that's where they say Fruit Loops actually originated from, is with the FROOT. I don't know why Wikipedia doesn't mention how before that lawsuit it was FRUIT. So who knows? Maybe the lawsuit didn't exist. I don't know, but that's what I found on the internet about it. But that could be something where a lot of the older people, like in their 50s or 60s, or even older, could have remembered Fruit Loops as being FRUIT. So it wasn't because they switched universes or anything. It's just simply that's how they remembered it, and they haven't eaten Fruit Loops in such a long time, and they never took notice of it after all of these years that was the last memory that they recall. But when you start to remember the last thing you recall, a lot of times our memory fails, so we don't remember the full thing. So that's a possible explanation too, and I think the most logical explanation. There's no evidence that we have parallel universes or anything like that. There's other examples that I could give, like Bernstein and Bernstein Bears. A lot of people remember it with EIN, but actually the Bernstein Bear books were named after the Bernsteins, which is AINS. So that was their name. So logically it makes sense that the books would be that name. And if you really focus in on it, and I was trying to do this because I grew up with those books too. Well, the more that I thought about it, and I just kept focusing and focusing and focusing and picturing it in my mind, I started to realize, yeah, that is actually the correct way that it's spelled, is Bernstein with the AIN. At first glance, your brain tries to play a trick on you and think, no, because most people's names are EIN, so you just assume that's how the book would have to be as well. But think about this. When we were growing up, a lot of things weren't they didn't make things logical. This was pop culture. So, Curious George, you'd think that he had a tail, but they made it a little different, and so he didn't have a tail. Or the thing with the Fruit Loops, instead of spelling it actually fruit, they did FROOT. That's how a lot of things were back then. So yeah, I just thought I'd give my 2 cents. And the other thing that is kind of, I think disturbing and kind of dangerous too with this Mandela effect that maybe not more people are talking about, is the fact where they even go so far as to say that even things in the Bible have been changed. But that's not true at all. A lot of people will come up with this one about how the lion lay down with the lamb in Isaiah. And that's actually not the correct verse. What it is the wolf will lie down with the lamb. And this is talking about when Christ comes back to reign for 1,000 years, during that period of peace. And if you think about it, if you read that whole verse, there's already a lion in there. So it wouldn't make sense if it said lion 2 times. And there's other verses in the Bible where if you put lion instead of wolf, the whole thing would not work. It would just all fall apart. So when you take the whole thing together, like a big puzzle, the pieces wouldn't fit together properly if you had a lion in there. And somebody made a good video about that already on YouTube, where they debunked that. Now, a lot of people say that other things were changed, but actually, it isn't that it was changed. It's just that in different translations, like different versions, King James, NIV, there's different versions of the Bible. Some of them say a different word, and some of them don't. So it isn't that, somehow we were switched into a different, parallel reality or universe or what have you. It's just the fact that there's different translations, and that's why people get the different words. There's nothing mysterious about that at all. But people like to claim amazing, mysterious, crazy things are happening. I think it's more of like a psychological thing where people because if something like that happened, they'd like to feel really important. It's almost like how it almost seemed like they were wanting, the end of the world to come in 2012. They were taking stock and hold of something, but it was just misinformation, because the Mayans didn't really predict the end of the world. It was just a new calendar year. So a lot of times it can just be a psychological thing where people want to believe these things are occurring. They want to believe that something is bigger than what it actually is. Because maybe it makes life more interesting. Maybe it makes them feel more important. You know, there's a lot of different ways I guess you could think about it. But what I find most telling is just the fact that the Mandela effect really ought to cause us to reflect on our own selves and help us to realize, our memories aren't as good as what we think. And that should motivate us actually to want to preserve our memory, to think, to focus more on certain things that matter to us. If you don't remember the line in Star Wars where it says, "No, I am your father," when Darth Vader is speaking to Luke, and instead you think it's Luke, "I am your father," it's because you weren't focusing in. That wasn't something so important for you to memorize. And so when other people just started to say the wrong line, then that's what you actually believed without actually researching and looking it up. So you just kept repeating the same thing over and over and over and over, and that got ingrained in society, and that's why large amounts of people believe such a thing. So it should cause us to want to make more efforts into really paying more attention. And also, if it's something that you think is really important, that it would be stored in your memory. Obviously, these little trivial matters aren't really things that are really super important. So our brain, when you were younger, it didn't take the time to really process that and store that in your memory because you didn't think that was that important. You were kind of just more focused on the character, you were more focused on the show, whatever it was, your brain just didn't think that was the most important thing. It doesn't mean that you switched realities. It just means that we're imperfect human beings with an imperfect memory. And that kind of stuff can happen. But it should also cause us to look at our own ego, right? So are we proud, are we so proud that we can't ever admit that we're wrong about something? Those times where you could have sworn, I know this is a memory I had, I cannot be wrong. But somebody else says, no, this isn't actually the way it was. It's just that matter of sometimes thinking, that maybe I'm not right. Maybe my memory isn't as good as I thought. And that humility is important too in discovering the real truth, to analyzing things, to thinking things through and logically, without going berserk and attributing everything to some conspiracy theory or some wild idea that's not rooted or supported in any facts. And that brings me to my next point, which is this kind of stuff can actually be really dangerous. This is like a deceiving type of a thing because, look, if people are made to believe that they're switching in and out of different realities, which is this thing that's going around, people spread this kind of information, it can scare people and it can make people to start to even doubt the Bible. Well, that's one of the deceptions that Jesus warned about in the first place is, look out for wolves in sheep's clothing. Look out for these things, and that's exactly it. It's about trying to make a bunch of people doubt something when in reality they never really read the Bible, right? They never really studied it, and they don't really remember it as much as they thought they did. And so they're easily deceived and swayed into picking up popular lines that people spread or books or what have you. And they believe that rather than what's actually in there. So that's why it can be dangerous to the point where it comes down to you can't even trust anything. You can't even trust anything. Certainly, we don't live in that type of a universe because laws, science, technology, none of it would work if we couldn't trust our own memories, if we couldn't trust our own reason and reality. So that's my whole thing on this Mandela effect. I think it's really silly when you actually think about it, and I think there's a lot of explanations why people have false memories. It happens all the time. Most of us don't have a good memory. I mean, can you remember what you had for dinner, you know, two 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago? A lot of these Mandela effects are things that happened years and years and years ago, like back in the 90s or before that even. So in order for you to remember such a trivial memory of something, it's kind of silly when you can't even remember what you had for dinner, a week ago. It's asking a lot of yourself, and if you can't have the humility to admit that, then there's something more wrong with your ego, than there is with what's going on in the universe. So hopefully this is a video that sheds some more light on this topic. I know that I'm kind of a late person coming to this, and there's a lot of other videos on YouTube, but I thought that I would give my take, and maybe it'll help some people, maybe wake up some people too. Just remember that there's always an explanation, and it doesn't have to do anything with some wacky, crazy idea out there. God made the universe, at least I believe, and he wouldn't allow something like that to happen. Things in the universe are stable. They aren't changing back and forth like that. They're constant. They have to be fine-tuned for things to operate. So really think about that and really understand that we're not as perfect and great as we all think we are.